Welcome to the Standard H podcast, a casual conversation about the lives of entrepreneurs and those growing companies. I can't thank you enough for listening, as these episodes have been a wonderful supplement to the line of apparel that I'm thrilled to share is steadily growing. If you like what you hear, please visit standard-h.com and sign up for our email list. The website not only hosts every episode of this show, but also allows you to explore the entire product assortment and our latest travel recommendations. As an email subscriber, you will be the first to receive product release information as well as receive offers no one else is privy to. Just visit standard-h.com for more information. Seeing Standard H worn by a growing number of watch enthusiasts has been incredibly cool to witness, so chances are good if you're listening to this, you're probably an enthusiast already. However, if not, it makes no difference, as Passion Fine Jewelry welcomes everyone into their shop in Solana Beach, California. If you're already in deep, you'll know some of the brands that Tim Jackson and his team carry, which are some of the most highly sought-after independent watch manufacturers sold today. Names like Roger Smith, Grunfeld, Kudoke, Habring, Sarpaneva, and many more. If you can't make it to California, visit passionfinejewelry.com for their entire offering online. This episode is also brought to you by Cantonment. Cantonment's flagship product, the kerchief, is a perfect medium between a handkerchief and a bandana. Featuring iconic designs such as the Fender Stratocaster and the dashboard of a Volkswagen GTI, these utilitarian cloths are an item that should be a mainstay in your everyday carry. Tuck one in a back pocket or use one as a neckerchief. Visit them at cantonment.co, that's cantonment.co, and use the code STANDARDH in all caps, no spaces, for 20% off everything in their online shop. Now let's get to the show. Asher Rapkin and I met through a mutual friend in the watch space. Our good friend Brandon actually sold me my first IWC, and he sold Asher an independent or two from none other than Passion Fine Jewelry. Long story short, Asher and I were connected via text, and the conversations started flowing. As an IWC fan, I was immediately obsessed with the C3 from Collective Horology, Asher's limited edition collaborative watch business he co-founded and runs with his childhood best friend Gabe Riley. Sadly, I missed out on the C3 on its release. However, I was able to pick one up secondhand and absolutely love it. What I love most about Collective is the fact their designs, alongside the wonderful companies and watchmakers with whom they work, never feel like designed by committee, even though their results derive from several opinions involved. Asher's from New York City, so we spend a fair amount of time discussing his upbringing, his career in marketing at the likes of MTV and Facebook, and a band called Fish. I'm always interested in what Asher has to say, because everything he says is so well considered and often thought-provoking, which makes me feel very fortunate to call him a friend. Needless to say, I'm excited about my conversation with Asher, so let's get to it. I'm your host, Wesley Smith, and you're listening to the Standard H podcast. Asher, great to see you. I always enjoy speaking with you, so I'm excited for this conversation for sure. In addition to that, you just got off of a recording, so I hope you're not too tired of talking about yourself.
Well, so it's good to see you too, man. And no, I'm very happy because the last I just got off a recording of Scottish watches, and we were talking about a watch that, but I'm sure by the time this goes live, will have already been public, which is a watch with a really great independent watchmaker that we did in partnership with some friends in England, the limited edition. So I didn't get to talk about myself, which is awesome because we were just talking about James Lamb, the watchmaker that we were featuring. So
okay, great.
This will be a fun pivot.
Okay, sweet. Well,
plus you got a lot more hair than Ricky, so it's a very different vibe.
Love you, Ricky. Ricky and I do not know one another, but I do know of Ricky and enjoy Scottish watches. So
he's a good man.
Sweet. Well, listen, I wanted to kind of start with just the idea and what community means to you.
Oh, geez. Okay, so ultimately, forget about watches. I've just always been into, on a personal level, niche communities or subcultures of one nerdy variety or another.
Okay.
As a little kid, like I loved Star Trek, went to Star Trek conventions, grew up and became ever so slightly less nerdy or maybe more nerdy, depending on how you want to talk about it, by going to tons of jam band shows and Fish shows, The Dead.
Oh, we'll get into
Blues
that
Traveler.
for sure.
Yeah, cool. And each of these like various different subcultures, they not only give you a home, but they help you feel, and this is going to sound intense, but I mean it, they make you feel so much less alone. Mm-hmm. Because there's this feeling that like that whatever it is that you like, whatever fantasy world you go to in your head, whatever passion you have, that there's somebody else out there that feels that way and that gets you, whether it's the the crunchy dude at the fish show, or the guy who understands your reference to some stupid Ferengi joke,
Right.
And all of this stuff, to me, like that's community. It's this feeling that like you're just welcome in a room of strangers.
I think to piggyback on what you're saying is, I think a lot of people forget that humans are pack animals, right? Like we're community type people, and the pandemic only exposed the greater percentage of my friends that are introverts, which I was unaware of prior to the pandemic, because I had just copious amounts of friends who are like, oh man, this is amazing. I don't have to go anywhere. I don't have to see anybody. I don't have to do anything.
How long did that last though? Because my wife is a very proud introvert,
right?
And even she got to a point where she was like, yeah, I'm done. I'm over this.
Do you find it funny that most introverts are proud to be introverts, whereas you've never heard one extrovert be like, yeah, I'm an extrovert, and brag about it? Because like I feel like introverts brag about
it. I'm being an extrovert. I'm just like I'm just neurotic. So maybe it's like if you're an extrovert, you're neurotic, and if you're an introvert, you're proud. I don't know.
That's a really yeah. I guess that's a really valid outlook, or
which
I guess
probably makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because I guess if you're an extrovert, you're probably concerned about what other people think about you. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, you're certainly exposed to the opinions far more, right?
Sure.
So
100%.
Yeah.
So there's things that I've learned from my wife as an introvert. Like she will regularly remind me, like, why do you care what person X thinks? Like, why are you so obsessed with X, Y, or Z? And I'm jealous of her ability to be like, meh.
Do you find that there's a common answer to that question, regardless of the subject?
I don't know. I think, look, I grew up, I'm a New York Jew, so I think neuroticism is just like coded into my DNA, but that's a dodge. I think sometimes it's, at least for me, there's so many things that I care about. And when I feel like I'm putting myself out there, like there's always a fear of, did I screw up? Did I make a bad choice? But then I also am addicted to putting myself out there. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that's like an addiction cycle or a flywheel,
right?
But it's definitely like a personality trait.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I definitely want to get into like your kind of upbringing in New York for sure.
Sure.
What was that like? Is there any like standout memory in particular from growing up? I mean, obviously everybody has like a million memories, right?
Yeah.
But like, what do you like? What would you say you remember most about growing up in New York City? As somebody who's like always aspired to live there, but now I'm like kind of too old to move there.
Well, I once got told that to be happy in New York, you need to be either young or rich.
Yeah.
One or the other.
100%.
I am neither anymore. So, but, I mean, look, I'm married with 2 children in a small town in California, and I'm keenly aware that my children's existence will be their experience rather of growing up will be very different than mine was.
Sure.
For me, so much of it was defined by this feeling of like enclosed adventure. Like New York to me is very much I don't want this to sound like, Snake Plissken-y, kind of style New York, but it's like it's an enclosed space.
Sure.
And even though it's gigantic, like it feels like it's its own thing. And within that space, growing up, like I explored. My parents, when I was 10 years old, was the first. I started being allowed to walk to school by myself. Although I only found out a couple years ago that my dad was actually following me a block behind.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. So I'm like, hey. Also, aw, but
Right.
it's whatever. But I would take the subway everywhere. I would get in taxi cabs. And this was long before cell phones, right? So you were just out in the world until you were told to come home, and that was kind of it. And so for me, so many of the memories that I have are about these little, corners of New York that I used to haunt because I loved them, like. Mott Street in Chinatown, where I know where I get like my favorite, dumplings, where I still go, or places that aren't there anymore, like the Wetlands, a great music club, from the 1980s and the 1990s in Lower Manhattan, which now are these beautiful, quote unquote, beautiful, expensive high rises, and back then it was just a total shithole, but had this amazing oasis in it,
Totally,
of music. Or just little things like hanging out in Central Park with your friends in the summer, So there are these like sporadic memories here and there of it that really define the experience of it for me. But I try not to fall into that bucket of like, oh, growing up in New York like really shaped me as an artist or what. No, I mean, like growing up in New York is like growing up anywhere, but it for being such a just dramatically well-known city and so big, it's amazing how small and welcoming it can feel.
Sure.
If that's just what you think of as home.
Yeah. One thing I've always said about New York, like obviously never having lived there though, is you're constantly sharing a wall with somebody.
Sharing many walls with
somebody.
Yeah.
So like your like potential to feel away from everything, even when you're at home, to quote unquote get away from it all, you're not really getting away from anyone. You know what I mean?
Well, so a fascinating thing about big city living, at least in my opinion, is this forced anonymity, even though proximity is so high. Just ride a subway car that's packed, and you are physically touching strangers, and yet no one acknowledges one another.
Right.
So there's there is an anonymity and a privacy that's sort of forced and built in to the experience of living in a place like New York, where if I was, in a similar situation here, it would be shocking and creepy. But in New York, it's just like, that's how it is. You're just pressed against people.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I think it really like there's so much of an internal life that happens in New York. Like I listen to music so much more in New York than I do here because I'm just constantly in headphones, because that was a way to just like have your space.
Right. Right. Which
is different than California living, where sure, you have a car with an amazing sound system and whatever, but I don't feel, but I feel very like expanded, compared to the way that I would have been growing up as a New Yorker.
Yeah, I think walking around with headphones and quite literally exposed to the elements feels like you're in your own little world, even more so than in a car, because the car is what's doing the navigating, not you physically, right? So,
yeah, and it's funny too that you mentioned the navigating thing, because like that's a skill in New York, learning how to weave through the streets. And I'm taking my daughter, who's 5 years old, to New York for the first time as like a cogent child. She came when she was 10 months. This will be her first time really experiencing it. And there are these things that I keep trying to explain to her about like the existence in New York. Like we're gonna have to bob and weave, and things are really loud, and everything is just like the sensory experience of the city is so profoundly different than the sensory experience of like a cul-de-sac in a sleepy beach town.
Right.
And and these are things that like they're skills that like I've lost. Like I don't know how to bob and weave in Midtown anymore.
Right.
I've lost a little bit of the eye in the back of my head in terms of like identifying a shady character or two. And these are skills that like I want to get better at, so I can give them to my daughter, so that if she ever wants to live in New York or anywhere else, that like she doesn't come across looking like a country mouse.
Right. Right. How often do you get back to the city?
Before we had our kids, I used to go very regularly, and now, my parents still live there, and I try to go a few times a year. But as you can attest, like the older you get, the longer that flight feels.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And like going from LAX to JFK is like a 10-hour thing between the gates and the this and the that. And, you know, so, and being away from a family, you know, where I'm leaving my two kids with my wife, and, you know, my wife's traveling for work this weekend and vice versa. Like, it's a lot.
Yeah.
So as much as I love New York, like I have to go, you know, less than I want because of the realities of family life.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You said you're in California. I know you're in Ventura, which is, you know, I guess just south of Santa Barbara, but north of Los Angeles. Were you in the Bay Area before?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I lived in the Bay Area twice. I moved there right after college
Okay.
to take a job, my first job in television. And you know, the job was basically like, if you can get here in a week and a half, you can have the job. And I was like, cool.
Oh, wow. What was the gig?
So before I ever got into watches professionally, long before I ever got into watches professionally, I spent about 20 years in marketing. And the first 10 years of that marketing career was in television. And it started at a television network that doesn't exist anymore called Current TV. And Current TV was started in, I think it was 2003. Mm-hmm. And it was founded by Al Gore, actually.
Wow.
It was, it was his project after the loss of 2000. And he started this network, and basically the idea, and this predates YouTube, mind you, the idea was to use user-generated content, these short-form, what the network called pods, basically 7 to 8 minute long content, you know, well, pods that were submitted by users. So it was user-generated content on network cable television, more specifically. And you know, there was some original content that was produced, but a lot of it was around user generation. Even the ads, many of the ads were user-generated. It was really, really cool. And you know, there were all sorts of funky things about it. Like we couldn't get rated because, you know, no one knew how to rate that.
Right.
You know, even like I used to submit, like, you know when you go on TV and you see like the digital programming guides, it's like, oh, what's on TV? So like there is some poor schmuck, that was me, who actually submits that crap to Tribune Media Services every week, and I used to do that, and it was impossible. Like I literally just had like long blocks that was like content. But anyway, I was like a junior marketing guy there, and you know, I started. I did all sorts of fun stuff that I had no business doing at the skill level that I had. And I subsequently ended up working at a couple other networks over those 10 years, from Current TV to MTV to NBC, and so I bounced around from network to network until my early 30s.
Well, what was it like working at MTV, and what year was that?
So I worked at MTV from 2008 till 2010 or 11.
Okay.
And you know, for me, I like, look, it was really cool. I mean, I was born in 1982. So I grew up watching MTV.
Yeah.
And MTV was like a big cultural thing for me. You know, like Spring Break was a thing. The VMAs were a thing. The movie awards were a thing. I watched TRL, you know. And like these were all like these were, you know, pre-internet cultural moments. Like if you wanted to hear the new single from Eminem or whatever, you know, you were going to see it on TRL. And you know, so for me, getting to work at MTV was an incredible moment, because you walk in those doors, you know, 1515 Broadway, and you know you go into the TRL studio, and it's like right there, you know, it's there. You get in the elevator, and you know, there's someone famous in the elevator with you, and that was my first time encountering like the mundanity of fame.
Right.
You know, where it's like you get into an elevator and there's Taylor Swift, and she's just like standing there, you know, and you're like, oh, hi. You know, hi, and that's it. You know, it's like, and it's not like, oh my God, it's just we're in the elevator.
Right, you're a human being. Right,
exactly. You know, and but so for me, like that was exciting, and I got to work on, you know, all these shows that I had, you know, watched forever, like The Real World, you know, or and in my job there was actually working with movie studios, so I would pitch them on creative ideas for marketing their films on MTV. So I got to work on movies like I Love You Man and
cool.
Star Trek, and yeah. So for, you know, a guy in his early 20s, it was an incredible job to get to learn how to do all of that and the mechanics of it, and then to do it in that kind of a setting. So I really enjoyed my time at MTV. I still have friends from that era too. I mean, it was it was a really odd and interesting place to work.
Right. Wait, so how did you get, well, I guess you didn't leave marketing per se, but how did you get in with Facebook? Obviously, because you're,
Yeah. So I always was a bit of a tech nerd and computer geek, if you were growing up, and I loved Apple computers.
yeah.
You know, when I was in elementary school, you know, I learned how to code very basic, like literally use BASIC on like, you know, an Apple II or 2GS, and I had an Apple clone, a Laser 128K that I used to play, you know, old school games like
Oregon Trail
in San Diego. Yeah, of course. You know, axle's broken, shoot the buffalo.
Yeah. Dysentery.
And exactly. Yeah. Oh man. So I idolized Steve Jobs growing up. Like I used to read Macworld magazine and all that crap.
Yeah.
And I always wanted to work at Apple, and I tried every single year. I would like look on the job board and apply, nothing. Look on the job board, apply, nothing. And I got called by a recruiter from Apple when I worked at NBC, because one of Steve's last projects before he left and subsequently passed was to start an advertising platform at Apple called iAd. And, you know, this recruiter sends me an email on LinkedIn. It's like, hi, you know, we just looking for someone to run marketing for iAd. If this would be of interest to you. And I was like, bah! Which started a 11.5-month interview process. I kid you not.
Wow.
That ultimately resulted in me getting a job at Apple. Which
Did you have to like write an essay or something, or like?
I just was interviewed by like 1.5 million people over a long period of time, because you know when you're applying for a job, it's like all you think about, but nobody else cares.
Was there? Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. Was there any question that stood out where you were just like, oh shit, how am I going to get through this?
What I think I learned in that interview process, which has subsequently served me really well, is the realization that, you know, I think when you start interviewing for jobs, or at least when I started interviewing for jobs, like I always wanted to try and convince someone that like I was who they were looking for, versus what I think is a more successful way of interviewing, which is just being yourself. And if somebody's really attracted to you and the way you think and the way you're going to work, then that's always going to work out better than if they bought some sort of like perfected version of yourself.
Right. Like don't sell yourself, just be yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And I understand why people are nervous about that, because it's like, oh, I really got to get the job, like, da 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 da. But,
Yeah.
you know, in the end, the way I always look at it is like, if you are yourself and you get the job,
Yeah.
then they really wanted you, you know?
Yeah, I think that's fair, because I mean, at the end of the day, nobody really wants to be sold anything. They just want to buy stuff that they like.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
It's true. It's true. And I think also hiring managers, the best hiring managers are the ones who like really do go into an interview with an open mind and sometimes come out, you know, like one of the best people I ever hired is somebody that I remember reading their resume and being like, no way. And then meeting with them and I, you know, subsequently hiring them because they were just incredible. And it only works if you're, you know, open-minded to that. So to go to your point, like, I don't know if there was like a question, but I just decided, I'm like, if I'm going to work here, you know, if I'm going to get this job, it's going to be because somebody really wants me, not because I'm going to try to like fit the mold of whatever an Apple employee, you know, is.
Right. That's good advice.
But yeah, I mean, look, I will tell you though, it was to this day, from like a professional standpoint, just like there was like the 13-year-old in me when I walked in the doors at One Infinite Loop, you know, and got my Apple badge and just all of it. It was, you know, sat down, had lunch, and like Johnny Ive was, you know, eating lunch there too. And I'm like, it's Johnny Ive.
Right.
You know, like for me, it just was, it was like this incredible moment. It wasn't like a job. It was like a thing. Like my wife made fun of me because when Steve Jobs died, like I cried, and we had only been dating for a few months. And she's like, what the fuck is wrong with this guy?
Right.
You know? And I'm like, probably still answering that question to this day. But,
Yeah.
you know, but I felt, I used to really feel a deep passion for that place, and getting to work there was just like it put me on the path, you know, to your much earlier question of like, you know, working in tech.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I didn't take the job because I wanted to work in tech. I took the job because I wanted to work at Apple.
Right.
And that's kind of what set me on that path.
Well, it was so ingrained in your life just with the experience of using their computers, right? Like, so it was embedded early on probably as just a product you enjoyed using, and then let alone growing older and understanding Steve as a human being and his contribution to God, just the way the world is now. You know what I mean?
Well, Apple was also was representative of counterculture for so long.
100%.
You know,
My
and
dad,
like,
my dad was an IBM guy. So like
yeah,
it like yeah, Apple was never even talked about in our house ever. You know? And that's pre Lenovo and all that. You know, I mean, there's just yeah, we never talked about Apple until I got into snowboarding DVDs and understood that everybody edited snowboarding videos on Mac computers. And I was like, oh, dude, I got to get me a MacBook, you know?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it for so long, you know, being an being an Apple user was this like, you know, it was like this secret thing where it's like, oh, you use Macs,
Right.
Cool, you know, like that's
It
awesome.
was like the creative suite, right? Like
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
it.
Well, that was the other thing. It's like artists, musicians, filmmakers, like they all used Macs. You know, it was the stodgy like office types that would use, you know, Microsoft
PCs,
products.
yeah.
Exactly. And there was that divide. You know, obviously that's not all of that's done now, but there was that period, and you know, it's like that. It's like one of the most iconic ad campaigns really exemplified that, the Think Different campaign. You know, it's like had nothing to. There was nothing in there about the product. It was just, look, these are all the people that are the oddballs, the weirdos, the outcasts. Like, this is who we idolize, you know? And there was a time, you know, even when I was there at the 35th anniversary of the Mac, you know, where they once again put the Jolly Roger up over Apple headquarters. And even though that didn't really feel appropriate for a company of a multi-billion-dollar market cap in the way that it was at the time, it was a nod to that era when all of those folks who worked at Apple were pirates, you know?
Right.
And were really just, it's just like they were going against the grain of everything.
Right.
And there's something about that I will always admire and love. And having an opportunity to be inside those walls for a couple of years was something that I honestly will always cherish.
Oh, that's awesome. So then that bridged the gap, I guess, over to Facebook eventually.
Yeah, so I went to Facebook in 2015. It was a very different company then,
Right.
Much smaller. You know, I think there were 10,000 full-time employees when I joined, which is big by most standards.
Sure.
Relative to when I left in 2022, you know, the company was, I think with the, I don't know the exact number, but I think with contingent workers, it was probably six figures of employees.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's an internal tool at Facebook where you can see how long you had been there relative to everybody else. And by the time I left, I think I had been there longer than like 98% of the people who had been there.
Wow.
Yeah. So for me, that was a really interesting experience because, you know, in the beginning when I was there, it was still a pretty young company, and so much of what was happening in there was like experimentation and curiosity and people generally, you know, really trying to like figure out big problems and do the right thing. And, you know, over time it grew, and I think there's still a lot of beautiful things about the company, but now it's just, it's a very big company, you know, and that's a very different kind of vibe and feeling than when you are going in a place and going into the doors of a place and you really feel like you're building it, you know. And when Gabe, my partner, and I started our company 5 years ago, give or take, you know, I think part of what that has done for us while we were still working at Facebook and building Collective was that Collective really gave us that outlet to be able to have that entrepreneurial, adventurous spirit of like, there's more work than the two of us can handle, you know? So everybody does everything, you know, and the people who do whatever they're doing it because they're better at it than the other person. Like, there's things Gabe does for Collective that I'm terrible at, and vice versa.
Sure.
You know, versus the way corporations structure it, which is like, congratulations, you know, individual contributor level 6, you will complete the following tasks on this day. You know, it's not necessarily bad. It's just different.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. What were the teams like there, like size-wise? Like, because what's the psychology, right? Like teams work best in 11 or fewer people or something like that?
Yeah, I feel like people are always surprised when I tell them, but like, you know, my teams, you know, and I wasn't super senior at Facebook, but I was senior enough, and you know, so I built and ran a few teams, and they were never very big. I think the biggest team I ever ran was like 8 folks internationally. You know, just recently I was working on virtual reality, augmented reality, and things like that right before I left. And my team was 3 people.
Yeah, that's great.
All incredible humans, but 3 people. And it's funny when you say that to someone because they think
100,000 employees. Yeah.
Yeah. But in reality, like a lot of the work is done, in these small working groups. And I actually think that's great because that's great for career development. It's great for relationships. It creates a good environment because with 3 people working on something, like everybody has to work. You know what I mean? Like no one's hiding.
Right.
When you have a team of like 55 people, like there could be someone just like
loafing,
off in the corner. Yeah, just moving stuff around inside of Google Docs,
Yeah, totally.
But when it's 3 people, like everybody knows everything and everyone has to support each other.
It is kind of funny. You just said that you worked at Facebook or now Meta and people are using Google Docs.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. There's like a certain irony to that, but
yeah,
that's funny. Well, you mentioned Fish earlier because I want to talk music with you.
Yeah.
Fish was actually one of the first bands I ever saw live. It wasn't the first, but it was maybe, I don't know, within my first maybe 5 concerts, I guess.
Oh, cool. What do you remember what show that was?
It would have been certainly in the 90s, maybe 96, 97 maybe. It was at
Walnut. The Cowfunk phase.
I mean, it was Walnut Creek Amphitheater and it rained and I just remember seeing lightning coming down and I think they stopped the show for a few minutes, but nobody went anywhere. So we're just sitting in the rain. And then it was amazing. Right? Like it was very memorable in that sense. Like I'll never forget seeing lightning over the amphitheater and I just knew. And then of course it's Fish. And the funny thing is that's the only time I've ever seen them live.
So I've seen that band, I don't even know, 30, 40 times, which relative to any normal human is like like too many times to see a band.
Right.
But for Fish is like probably not that impressive.
Right.
And there's a lot of folks and a lot of good reason to make fun of Fish and Fish fans. But I think, for me, I remember going to my first Fish show, which was around the same era. I think it was 97. And I had just never seen something like that before. Like I had seen improvisational music in the context of jazz, but like I wasn't musically mature enough to really understand what was happening.
Right.
And that to me, like that's always the bummer with jazz in the sense that some of it's very melody driven, some of it's very technical, some of it's both, and some of it's neither. And if you get hit with the wrong introduction, it like turns you off hypothetically to the whole genre, which is an extreme bummer.
Right.
With Fish, I remember going in and I just had never seen people improvise music in that way before, and I had never seen a crowd of people react to that music in that way before. And it, I had just started learning how to play guitar, myself. I ultimately gave that up and became a bass player, but I remember just watching that and it just, I had never, put you this way, I had never gone to a show where I didn't get bored at some point, and I never, not for 1 second, was bored at that show. And it just, it changed my mind about what was possible. And at that point, you asked me earlier about community. There were these proto communities that existed.
Totally.
In the early days of the internet there, like fish.net, where you would literally meet up at set break with people who would go to a payphone and call in the set list for all the people at home to be able to see what had just been played. And then you could add yourself to what was called a tape tree, which was basically, a taper, because you were allowed to legally tape Fish shows with taper tickets, would take those tapes. They would then go home, make copies. They'd send it to their people on the tree, and then their people on the tree would send it to their people on the tree. And there was a certain level of status in the community of like how high you were on the tree, because that also meant that you had higher quality recordings.
Right.
Because it was, you weren't like 10, 11,
you weren't
12
the 10th
photocopies
dub.
down the road. Yeah, exactly. On some shitty tape deck from Radio Shack. And so there was like a whole proto community there of these like packages being shipped all around the world, and subculture of how people would decorate the like J card for their, for the cassette tape and the whole thing. And, it really was, for an awkward teenager like me, an incredibly welcoming community that I think set me up to be open-minded with things in ways that I might not have been otherwise.
That's really cool, man. I think there's probably very few bands that offer that same sentiment.
You know, I feel like it's interesting because there are other bands I feel like have cultures that are really tied to them that do, you know, encourage open-mindedness and diversity. Like Pearl Jam did it for a while. I feel like there's like a big touring community around them from like the 90s on. Tool, believe it or not.
I totally
Like,
agree with you. Dave Matthews Band, of course.
For sure. You know, and it's just, there's like, a Blues Traveler is another one. I mean, Gabe Riley, my partner, actually used to work for Blues Traveler.
Oh, is that right?
So, yeah. He was an intern for Blues Traveler. He would organize all of Popper's backstock harmonicas because John Popper would, you know, blow out the reeds of virtually every harmonica he plays at every show. So he like literally has to buy like 300, 400, 500 harmonicas for every tour. So you need some guy to organize that. That was the other interesting thing about all these bands. So many of them actually came out of like similar communities.
Yeah.
So like both Fish and Blues Traveler came out of Princeton, New Jersey. Like as high school, like Trey Anastasio and John Popper.
Yeah.
You know, they all grew up in the same like just melting pot of suburban, you know, mediocrity. It's like, it's so interesting to see how this stuff happens.
Oh, that's crazy. Does Gabe play the harmonica?
I think he will play a harmonica.
Understood. Okay, fair enough. Oh man, that's funny. So you play bass?
Yeah.
Do you still mess around?
I do. I wish I suspect as my kids get older, I'll probably start playing again more. It's right now, you know, with a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, it's hard to do much of anything.
Right.
But I love it and I miss it. You know, bass is such a wonderful instrument and it's so much fun to play. You know, and I also grew up in that era where electric bass was like very much a focus, and there were some bass players like from that world, like Victor Wooten. I don't know if you ever came across him.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. So like, you know, Victor Wooten was one of my bass playing idols, and you know, it's the kind of thing where you'd hear him play, and that's just not the sound that ever came out of that instrument before to me. Like that's just, you know, and that really sent me down a path that moved me away from guitar playing. So I never was a very good guitar player.
So I played drums and was like the two people encouraged me, or I guess motivated me to play drums. One, Carter Beauford, who's the drummer of Dave Matthews Band.
Crazy drummer.
And Victor Wooten would sit in with those guys on live shows from time to time. And then, of course, you have Flea, you've got Les Claypool, like all those 90s bands of, you know, Primus, Red Hot Chili Peppers. They just blew your hair back with the bass guitar. You know what I mean?
Well, and the thing is, like, that's what I wanted to do. Like, when I graduated college, what I wanted to do was be a touring manager.
Oh, cool.
And it's funny. So when I graduated from college, I had I worked at this Mac store, this Apple store in New York called TechServe, which no longer exists.
Okay.
It was a great spot, and you know, we sold a lot of pro audio gear. So every once in a while, guys would come in from the road, and this one guy came in who was the touring manager, as it turns out, for Alicia Keys.
Oh wow!
And I ended up shooting the shit with him for a while, and you know, and this is me, 21 years old, you know, and he's like, well, if you're interested in this sort of thing, like, do you want to come and do you want to do it? Do you want to come and check it out? He's like, I need a backline tech. He's like, and I was like, oh, okay. So I spent some time in the studio with him, and then did a couple shows with him and on the road, like big arena shows, and that fixed me up right quick about the idea of wanting to work in live music.
Really?
Because I feel like when you are growing up and you're a teenager, you're like, tour buses, cool, man, like backstage pass, cool. And then you spend time talking to some of these folks, like they never see their families.
Right.
They don't know where they are.
Yeah.
Some of them don't have houses, because why bother? You just live in a bus.
Right.
And it just, even at 21 years old, I looked around and I was like, this just feels lonely.
It's way worse,
you know,
than that flight to JFK becomes as you get older.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it was like that first glimpse into, like, there's what you see and what you imagine, and then there's the practical reality of it. And now sometimes I look at acts that are touring, and I look at the 40 dates, and I'm just like, Oof,
Yeah.
man.
Brutal.
Yeah. So it was very eye-opening. So I got cured of that right quick.
Yeah. What did your parents do when you grew up?
So my mom worked in advertising. So I guess I come by it honestly. She was a magazine publisher, and she worked on magazines like Modern Bride and Food and Wine,
Oh,
and
cool.
Condé Nast Traveler, stuff like that.
Nice.
My dad is an audio producer and has made audio books and radio drama for my entire life.
Wow.
So he directed and produced all of the like Harry Potter books on audio tape, and tons and tons of other stuff. So I grew up with his studio in our house.
Early
Just
adopter,
watching
I
him
would
work.
say.
Oh yeah, I mean he bought into digital audio workstations like way early. I remember he spent some ungodly amount of money on like an Apple Quadra,
Okay.
a Mac Quadra. It was like one of the first towers. And Pro Tools, which is now like de rigueur, but back then was like seriously special stuff. And I remember him showing me with deep pride how his workstation could have four tracks playing at the same time.
Wow. Oh man, that's
Yeah.
crazy. Are they both
Yeah.
still working today, or are they retired?
Oh, they won't stop working until their final day.
Really? So what magazine's your mom at now?
She works on her own now, so she's a freelancer, and she's she's been in and around the industry since the early 1970s. So I think
She knows everybody.
advertising, yeah, and advertising is just one of those industries where it's like the technology changes, but the industry is largely the same in many ways. So I think it's one of those places where experience is really valued versus derided.
Is there any lesson that your mom taught you in the advertising world that you still kind of use today?
Yeah, I mean, relationships are everything. I mean, and I guess it's true about any industry really, but advertising, it was just not dissimilar in some ways from the watch world in this way.
Yeah.
Your reputation, your word is really, and your work is ultimately why people will talk to you and work with you.
Mm-hmm.
And if bad work is just not, you can't get away with it.
Right.
And bad reputation, the same.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fair. We'll get to collective horology. What's on the wrist though right now?
I am wearing a relatively new watch for me, but one that I'm very excited to have, which is a 50th anniversary Snoopy. I putting the hype of this thing aside and the rest of it, it's just a really charming watch, and I got it after I placed my order for it. When it came out, I just got it 2 years later.
Right.
But it's one of those watches that just has so much soul and whimsy,
Yeah.
that I just get such a kick out of it.
Yeah. It's so funny. Like, you don't put it into these terms often. You, the collective you, right? Like all of us. Not the collective, no pun intended. Zing. It's just the fact that Snoopy can live on a watch that's that expensive. You know what I mean? You're just like, I think that it speaks to the whimsy or the whimsical approach that exists in that
a lot
piece.
of it also, yeah. Well, what's funny is I actually don't care for the silver Snoopy, the one that came before this. I don't like the dial design, which is funny because Apollo 13. Like, I obviously am too young to remember it, but I remember the movie.
Right.
And like the movie was one of the most incredible things I'd ever seen.
Sure.
I still think it's a great film.
Yeah.
So it's like Apollo 13 culturally is a thing that I like. I like space in general, et cetera. So I like the whole story of the Silver Snoopy Award and the rest of it.
Yeah.
But this one just, I don't know. One of the things I have to give up, I think, as I've collected, is I don't take myself very seriously as a collector.
Okay.
And when you let go of that, so many watches become interesting and fun.
I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like I get sad sometimes when I talk to people and they have all of these rules for themselves that feel like they've come from external sources, and like they don't matter.
Right.
At least in my opinion, like they don't matter. If you like it, it's great.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to take itself seriously to be a really great watch. You know, it's like pop art is art, even if it's not the same as like the art that you studied in art history.
Totally.
So I don't know. To me, this watch I love Speedmasters. You know, I love the story of Apollo 13, and this watch it doesn't take itself seriously at all. I mean, for God's sake, like Snoopy flies around, you know, the moon on an automaton on the back. Like it's just fun.
Yeah. No, that's great. So speaking of collective horology, you mentioned Gabe Riley, your partner. I believe you touched on it earlier. The company is now 5 or so years old, I guess at this point.
Yeah, we started, you know, the first time we sat down, I found my original notebook too, which is always eye-opening when you're like, this is what I thought the business was going to be.
Right.
Yeah, and I sat down and I found my original notebook, and it was dated around like February-ish 2018. Because we started coming up with this when I was feeling all crazy at home on paternity leave with our first kid.
Now, is this a Mead 3-ring binder, or is this like a moleskin?
No, I'm very spendy when it comes to like paper goods.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, so my notebook of choice is a Smythson notebook.
Okay.
Which I'm sure people will then Google and be like, "The fuck is wrong with this guy?"
Same question your wife asks.
Oh, she's been nullified on that point. I think she's just come to accept it. But they're beautiful notebooks. So it's this leather bound notebook, etc. Anyway,
Cool.
So I found that, and you know, the business has subsequently evolved since then. So yeah, we're coming up on 5 years now, actually, I guess.
Yeah. So what's interesting is when I first learned about you guys, which I think I was maybe a year or two late in finding out about you guys, but you guys somehow coax incredible brands to work with you and create customized watches with you. How the hell does somebody who gets together with one of his best friends from middle school and says, "Hey, IWC, let's make a watch"? Like, how does that happen?
I mean, I think honestly, part of it is never underestimate the confidence you can get from pure ignorance. And I'm serious. Like, I think looking back now,
Yeah.
there are so many things and I'm sure this is true for Standard H too. I mean, I have to imagine, or anyone starting a small business, there are so many lessons that you learn over the course of your life, you know, from everything from the operations to the creative, you know, process, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And when you don't know those things, you're not scared that you're going to screw them up.
Right.
You know?
You don't know what you don't know.
100%. So I think for us getting started, I say this, I've said this many times and I stand by it, like we owe a lot to Zenith and to our friend Rob Kaplan at Topper Jewelers, who Zenith took a flyer on us, and Rob basically ran the operations of the first project.
Okay.
And we didn't have any visibility into that at all. You know, so in many ways, like what we thought a project was so much easier than it actually is, because we had a brand that saw something in there, even though we hadn't quite put our finger on it yet, and a partner who was a friend and was willing to help us. And
right.
So I think that, you know, ultimately like that's really how it started in terms of like the business.
I had that question written down, like whether or not Rob, you said Rob, right, at Toppers? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like whether or not he was like assisting in conversations in that way. So, I mean, I guess he was sort of a liaison.
Yes, kind of. So I met Rob about 10 years ago.
Okay.
When now I think back on it as someone who has a small retail business, and I'm like, God, I was such a dick. Where I walked in, you know, because I wanted a Nomos, and I tried to negotiate with him on a Nomos, and I'm like, for all the listeners out there, like I know it's a $3,000 watch, but like to be real, like, you know, after overhead, like whoever's selling it to you is going to make like $500. So don't be that guy. Just buy the watch.
Right.
Anyway, so I went and tried to negotiate, but don't be that guy. I mean, don't be me.
Well, and also don't be the person that like generates 4 different email accounts just to get the first time buyer's discount with your 4 emails. Like you're an asshole. Like,
Thank you. Okay, we're on the same page
yeah.
then. We'll put that up on the Don't Be That Guy board.
Yeah.
But anyway, so and then over time I would go into the store and we would chit chat. And Rob's a very affable, sweet man, and over time we just became friends, and then we became really good friends. And now I think of him as one of my best friends.
That's
We
great.
talk almost every day, and it's funny because like we're both technically competitors now in the sense that he retails fears and I retail fears, But I think it's good evidence that like people can be competitive in a space, but be collegial, not combative.
Sure.
Anyway, yeah. So in the early days, I remember having a conversation with him before we did our first watch, where I had this idea about what we wanted to do with collaboration. And we sat on this bench in Burlingame outside the Apple Store, and I took him through it. Like, here's what I think we want to do. Here's like the business model. Like, what do you think? And without missing a beat, he just looked at me and he was like, "I'll help you."
That's sweet.
I was like, "Yeah," and he did. He did. He made introductions on our behalf. He helped us operationally. I know now, looking back, although I didn't understand it at the time, I know now that he fronted cash that we didn't even know he fronted.
Oh, wow.
And don't get me wrong, like he took profit on the project too. Like this wasn't like completely, without benefit to him, but certainly not without risk either.
Well, and forgive me for interrupting here, but I guess this is where it backs up my point of coming into the awareness of Collective maybe a year or two late. I guess I wasn't aware. I guess you sold those Zenith watches through Toppers then?
Yeah. So the original model for Collective was that
Shout out Toppers, by the way.
Oh yeah, seriously, Topper Fine Jewelers in Burlingame, amazing place to go buy a watch.
Yeah.
Seriously, just hands down. In the early days, the model was we would design the watch with the brand, and then we'd work with an authorized dealer who would handle the import, the payment processing, and the delivery of the watches. And we would essentially split the retail margin with that dealer. And it would be advantageous to the dealer because they wouldn't get their full margin, of course, but they'd get a bulk order, and then we would get X, Y, and Z. But the thing is, over time, it's like when you do that on paper, it looks like a lot of money. But then when you actually amortize that over the time, and then all the marketing costs and, I don't know, compensating yourself.
Right.
It's not enough. So we had to, and that's actually what led to our retail business, because we were like, well, heck, we got to learn how to do this ourselves, because we have to be able to make enough of a margin so that we can live off this. Like, forget getting rich, just live off it.
Yeah.
And so our model evolved, but that was a good way to start because it allowed us to bootstrap it without needing investment, by using somebody else's infrastructure. I wish I could say that I approached that, with my sharpened pencil from my MBA, which I don't have.
Right.
But it was dumb luck driven by pure sweet ignorance.
Right. And friendship, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yes, absolute friendship. And Rob did a lot for us and continues to do a lot for us. Just like we will for him. He's a genuinely good human.
Sure. So how do you divvy up the to-do tasks and lists with you and Gabe? Like, who does what? Is it standard? Like, you guys have your roles, or does it change?
No, I mean, there are areas that I think I tend to get into, and I think areas that he tends to, and then there's just things that like we each, like Gabe learned how to build the shop, so he tends to operate a lot of like the back end.
I see.
Not for any great love of it, but like he just knows how to do it better than I can.
Right.
I tend to focus a lot on business development, identifying our roadmap. We both wring our hands all the time over how we want to grow and how we want to do that in a way that feels honest and transparent. I mean, it's really fascinating to transition from being a consumer of something that you love, like watches, to being a retailer of something that you love. Because so many things change for you, or at least for me, in terms of like what I thought was true or my perception of how this business operates.
Yeah.
So it's been a very fascinating and humbling journey, and one of the biggest lessons I've learned is excluding, the gigantic multi-store chains, your local authorized dealer does a lot more for you, the collector, than I think anybody gives them credit for. And I don't know that people fully appreciate the financial and emotional capital that gets invested in just being able to have this inventory available
Right.
for someone to check out.
Yeah.
And as I've learned more about that, my respect for people, especially independent retailers that take flyers on new brands, like what they're really risking is a lot more than I think people give them credit for. And it really shows that like ADs are in many ways a critical element of the backbone of our community and our culture.
I mean, not to blow up my own spot here, but like I think I completely identify with that, even just with Standard H with regards of, I think we were talking about this at some point, maybe even yesterday when we were just touching base about today's chat, but I'll release only a few things and, quantity, right? Like I'll do a small run of something just to kind of test the market. Like, are people into this shit or not, And then I go full, into it, from a production standpoint. So like the risk of me doing it in a and to me, it makes sense to do it that way, even though financially it's a lot more expensive to produce fewer items than it is to do a lot. But then there is like, okay, so for example, let me give you an example. Somebody asked a friend of mine, shout out Patrick in New York, actually. He was like, look, man, I love your hoodies. I love the fabric, but I don't want a hoodie. I just want a sweatshirt. So I'm like looking at developing a crew neck sweatshirt. And by the way, thank you for wearing the one you're wearing, the lightweight XK sweatshirt.
I wear this all the time, man.
Yeah, so, but I personally want a thicker one as well. And then I found out my buddy Patrick did. Well, the only fabric I had left over from my hooded sweatshirt was enough to make one crew neck sweatshirt. So that sample is being made right now.
It's like the Hanukkah story, man. Suddenly from one crew neck came
right.
8.
Right, exactly. Do we have enough oil? So the thing is that like, okay, so where I was going with this is like, oh yeah, like if you want one and I know I want one, maybe I could just make 2 and send you one because we did a trade on a product that he offers. Anyway, long story long, I had to hit him up and I said, Patrick, guess what, man? Like I only have enough fabric to make 1. And the problem is I've made this promise to you that it would be yours. So now you are going to have a 1 of 1 so far crew neck sweatshirt from Standard H, because otherwise I would have had to buy 1,000 yards of this fabric.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's
man.
like,
Minimum
you want
order
to talk
quantity
about
is a thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, exactly. And it's about that investment. And then the emotional investment on top of that of me being like, how bad do I want this crew neck sweatshirt even for myself, And like, it's kind of that way with watches, providing it from people. Like, what is my emotional implication or your emotional implication to what I have to do to give you what you want?
Well, so that's the other, and I'm curious if you go through this with Standard H as well, but there's a fascinating, so when we think about collective, there's kind of two ways we make money, essentially. We make collaborative watches, which are really Gabe and I finding an idea with a watchmaker that we admire and bringing something to life that we believe in, that we like, that's, that is something that we hope is that other people will appreciate. We never know. We just hope.
Right.
But then there's the other side of the business, which is retail. And retail is interesting to me because in that context, like I'm not buying for myself anymore.
Right.
Now I'm buying for what I think other people want. So you have this interesting, obviously there's overlap. Like I'm not going to buy stuff that I wouldn't be proud to sell, but within the line of watchmaker X or watchmaker Y, I have to choose what I'm going to buy,
Yeah.
And that's been a really interesting like reset of my brain between I'm going to put my, with collective collaborations, like this is an expression of Gabe. It's an expression of me. This is the watch that I will and want to wear. Like this is the watch I want to make versus, retail where I'm like, some of the watches that I sell, I'll give you an example. Like for Fear is a brand that I love. The watch that we sell the most of is not my favorite watch.
It's not your favorite.
That they make.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't really matter because everybody else likes it.
Right. Well, it's interesting you should ask the question, or at least insinuate that if it applies to standard H, because I've talked about this ad nauseum, I think, about the theory of chasing demand. So, like when I first launched the brand, I had this logo. So I started with a hat, then I put it on some T-shirts, and everybody kept saying, "I love the logo. I love the logo." But what I started to do is I started to chase demand, thinking that I could create products that I think people want. And what I found was, oh man, I mean, I love the logo. I just don't wear logos. And so I was like, well, great. Now I've got this inventory full of logoed shit, and nobody wants to buy it because they don't wear logos. They just were respecting the design. So I then was like, okay, well, then I need to take a step back. I need to like save up some more money so that I can actually produce the products that I personally wanted to produce from day one that I didn't because I misread the audience and thought that they wanted the thing they said was cool. And so that's how the Avant t-shirt came out. Is that was the stuff that I wanted to do from day dot, as it were. And then the long sleeve. And then, so then as Wesley, customer number one of Standard H, is like, now I refuse to make anything that I don't want to wear. So it wouldn't surprise me that the collective collaborative watches might sell better than something that you're just keeping stock in, because I think that's the brand, right? Like that's what collective is.
Yeah.
Not to say you shouldn't carry other brands in stock. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying, like, I think the thirst for what you guys create is what makes you special because you're creating it.
I don't disagree with you. And it's changed the way that we think about who we partner with.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one key lesson that we learned over the last 3 years in particular is, you know, I think we started this the way that anyone would start this business, which is, well, let's make a list of every brand we want to work with. And what we discovered pretty quickly, actually, is that the brand, I mean, of course the brand matters, but that's not the driving force behind what's going to make a good watch. What the driving force is if the person, like the human you're working with at that company, like is really a good collaborator and into the idea and wants it to be good, not an order. And where that's led us are to makers that weren't on that original list, but are so much better than people that were.
Interesting.
And that, you know, and that's someone like, I mean, you just had a guest on, you know, Claude Griesler. You know, Claude is an incredible collaborator, a really cool dude, and makes amazing watches. And Armin Strom was definitively not on my list in 2018.
Right.
Much to, you know, and that's a signal of my own, immaturity at the time as a collector, I would argue. Not anything about them. But I'm confident that the watch we made with them is better than something that we would have made with so many of the other brands that were on our target list. So,
sure.
To your point, you know, I'm willing to roll the dice on someone that I think is going to make something incredible. And when I say roll the dice, I mean, I'm really rolling dice here.
Yeah.
You know, like it's not, whether anybody buys these watches or not, like I still have to pay the
Yeah, you're
invoice.
still on the hook. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the similarity with Standard H. Like now I'm buying
100%.
I'm buying deep into the XK sweatshirt. You know what I mean? And now I'm sitting on inventory, you know.
Yeah, it's very intense to be in that moment where you are very proud of something, but are keenly aware that the money that you've put into it is your money, and nobody's going to bail you out. You know, there is no safety net, and that's it's scary.
It's stressful. Yeah.
It's so scary, and it's these moments where, you know, as a business, I mean, you know, you talk about this a lot on your show, and I think it's impossible to explain until you've experienced it yourself. Mm-hmm. But it's one thing when you work for a big company and you see these invoices coming across your desk and they go to accounts receivable and accounts payable and blah, blah, blah. It's a whole other ballgame when
it's your bank account.
You know, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's no alternative. So the investing in creativity is it's not just like, oh, this would be a cool project and I really like what they do. It's, I'm going to take a not insignificant part of my life savings and put it here because I think that this is something special.
Yeah.
And, going back to my earlier point about like ADs or independent clothing stores or things like that really being a backbone of a community, like what those people are doing is they are taking the gamble and the financial risk so that you can have the enjoyment of discovery.
Right.
And I don't mean that to wag a finger at anybody, because nobody owes anyone anything in terms of like what you buy or what you don't. But an appreciation, I think, for what those people do for the community of makers out there is something that I think often gets lost in the "why didn't my Snoopy arrive" conversation.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. No, it's a very valid point. What, speaking of production and such, how do you guys go about choosing what you do next?
We take a lot of ayahuasca and go into the woods. No, so
I need an invitation for that. I feel like I could use it.
Exactly. We go on a vision quest.
The old reset button.
We have a long roadmap. I'm extremely gratified to say, with watches with planned projects in various states of completion between now and towards the end of 2024. And these projects often take anywhere from 18 months on the short end to 3 years on the long end to bring to life. So we really have to plan out. And, Gabe and I have different styles and tastes. Gabe is more tool watch oriented, for example. So if you love the IWC, you have Gabe to thank for that, not me. And I tend to be more independent focused. So I like to sniff around in the indie watch world to find what I think is special and interesting and curious. And Gabe really focuses on, what he loves, which is, that sub $10,000 tool watch world and bringing something unique and special to life in there. So I think we complement each other well, and like who he wants to chase and who I want to chase tend to be a little bit different. And we both kind of give each other freedom in those areas because, the C3 is a much better watch with him designing it with Christian than it would have been with me. And, I think, with Urwerk and with Armstrong in particular, Gabe really loved it, but it's like those aren't brands that he really, he didn't know them as well. And I think he was just sort of like, this is interesting and cool, but like never in a million years have I thought about buying an Urwerk. So,
right.
Lead the way, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have a watch coming out this year that's sub $5,000 that he really did the design on, and I think it's amazing, and I love it, and I'm going to buy one for myself, But again, he knows the brand that we're doing it with inside and out in a way that I don't, and it shows in that watch.
Cool. Well, I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, me too.
You and I were talking about backyards and chronographs yesterday.
Yeah.
What's your philosophy on buying and selling from your own personal collection?
Sure. I am very public about and believe very strongly that we should destigmatize selling watches at any point, which is to say, if you've owned a watch for 2 months and you've experienced it, and that's the core for me of collecting. Collecting is about experience. I've owned hundreds of watches, and my experience of owning those watches helps me make better choices about what I want to keep, but also what I want to make.
Yeah.
I think this attitude that we see from brands of like, you may not sell this watch ever. How dare you?
Right.
I find not only deeply offensive, but frankly counterproductive to the watch industry. Because 9 times out of 10, when someone is selling a watch, they're going to go buy another watch.
Right.
And this concept that we all have to constantly invest but never divest is ridiculous. It's absurd. So to me, sometimes things need to move around. And, what we were taught, you referenced backyards, like we bought a house here in California a couple of years ago, and, Backyard needed a lot of work, and I had money in a chronograph to pay for it, and the chronograph sold, and I have the backyard. That doesn't take away the experience of me owning that chronograph, but but the backyard is more important for my family at this stage in my life. And I think brands in general spend so much time chasing and in some cases degrading their clients for doing something that they not only have the legal right to do, but quite frankly is none of the brand's business. And I think the sooner that we can get away from making collectors feel bad about this, the better it's going to be. That said, and I will caveat this, I understand why a brand would be annoyed if the demand for a watch is very high and the allocation process is laborious, and then many of the watches that they've allocated are immediately then resold, because it's frustrating to receive hundreds of emails saying, can I have it, can I have it, can I have it, say no so many times, and then find out that the people you finally did allocate it to are attempting to resell it. I understand the emotional component of that.
Yeah.
Even if I would argue that that no one has a business leg to stand on in that context.
Right.
But to that end, Collective has only, we encourage people, if they want to get out of their watches, that they can sell them. We'll even resell them for them. The only caveat to that is if you buy a watch from us and the day you get it, you've immediately resold it, and we see that as a pattern over time.
Right.
Then we may remove you from being able to buy. But again, it has to be a pattern, because sometimes you get a watch and you open it and it's just not for you.
Right.
And that's okay. Like, that is so okay.
Right. And something tells me, given the, I guess, membership, if I can call it that, with regards to the collective, something tells me that if that were to happen, I order a watch, I take delivery of it, I open it up and been like, ooh, this is not a bit of me. Chances are I'm going to text you, call you, email you and say, look, man, I'm going to communicate that sentiment.
Yeah, but the thing is, I also want people not to be like, it makes me sad when a client of ours or a member or whatever will reach out to us and be like, oh man, I'm so sorry. Like, God, I can't believe I need to do this, but I'm selling my watch. And I'm like, you don't need to feel bad.
Right.
Like, it's okay.
Yeah.
You paid me for this.
Right.
And I feel like there's this just weird negativity and judgment that is sometimes built into watch collecting around something that nobody has any right to have business on, which is like the personal finances of that collector.
Yeah.
That's nobody's business.
Sure.
And if the collector did what they were supposed to do, and if they bought a watch from dealer A or brand X or person Z, and they paid for that watch and they completed that transaction, the watch is theirs.
Right.
And I am on a mission to destigmatize this.
Yeah. Well, we haven't even touched on that, which we're starting to wrap up here, but how do you become a member of the Collective Horology group?
So when we first started, the model was different. The model really was about, like, we're going to have 50 guys and women who are, and we're going to make 50 pieces every year, and that's that. And if you don't buy a piece from us, every 2 years, we're gonna have to remove you. And what we realized two things very quickly. First of all, like, that is completely disrespectful to somebody's finances, because how could you possibly budget for something that you don't know the price of every 2 years? That's ridiculous.
Right.
And number two, because we want such diversity in our design, like we don't have a house style. We're not making the collective version of X, Y, or Z. It's impossible to know if there will be a watch to your taste every 2 years. So that didn't make any sense.
Right.
But the real reason that we were doing that was that we wanted to have an insular community where people felt comfortable. Mm-hmm. So over time, like, the requirements, quote unquote, for becoming a member have greatly diminished. And now, really, ultimately, what we've learned is that most people that want to be part of our community are great people.
Yeah.
And we want them. So at this point, to join Collective, which essentially gives you access to this community, to access to future watches before they go on sale publicly, all you need to do is buy a collaborative watch from us and tell us a little bit about yourself. and then we can bring you into the community. If you want to participate in it, that's great. And if you just want to be able to collect these watches, that is okay too. So I think part of it has been reevaluating what my definition of participatory community means and whether that's important. So nowadays, if you want a collective watch, it really is when you see the one that you like, if any strike your fancy, buy it, tell us a little bit about yourself, you'll join the group, and then you'll always know about subsequent collaborative watches first. We also tell all of our members about retail watches that we are offering first. So the goal is, we want it to be a reciprocal relationship. You have supported us, you're investing in us. We want to be able to give you something back, which is foresight about what's coming and visibility. Because one of the challenges of watch culture these days is sometimes like an amazing watch will come out and you have to make a split-second decision. Like, is the design work for you? Can you afford it? And if you can't make those decisions up in a couple of minutes, the decision's made for you.
Yeah.
And I don't like that. So I think giving people the ability to think about it is critical.
Yeah. No, I love that. Well, listen, man, I know I could go on forever and talk to you about, we didn't touch on knives. We didn't touch on cars. You do collect knives, so let's touch on it.
Sure. Yeah.
Why knives?
So in April of 2020, when I was readjusting to my new normal, I was looking for another hobby, mostly because I just wanted a good pocket knife. Like, I didn't have a good pocket knife. And like anything, like anyone saying, I want a good car, I want a good watch, right? Like you start to peel back a layer and you see that there's an entire world there that you didn't know about. And, there's a lot of overlap, I think, between watches and knives because there's so much machine work and handwork that goes into a lot of these objects that relative to watches are significantly more affordable in many ways, but are equally beautiful pieces of artwork, utilitarian, artwork. And I fell into that community. And it was interesting because, like, a lot of people that I ran into in that community come from a very different place than I do, like socially and politically. Like, I'm pretty left-wing liberally as a person. And there's a lot of people in that community that are more conservative and right-wingy. And what was really interesting and cool about that was that even in the midst of a very like rough year socially in the United States, I got more exposure to being able to talk to people who were different than me and hear alternative perspectives presented in a much more just honest and respectful and human way through knife collecting than anything else. So it's funny. It's like I don't obsessively collect knives the way I do watches. Like, I'll occasionally buy a knife now, maybe once every year or so, versus watches, which is way more than that.
Right.
But I enjoy being part of that community because it's nice to be part of a place that doesn't look like me or sound like me or an echo chamber of what I believe or what I think,
Yeah, that's true.
And I also feel like sometimes, like in those communities, they get a real kick that like California liberal guy is super excited about his new, his new knife
with the camo handle.
Yeah, totally. It's just like, and I'm like, yes, don't worry. Like, liberals like knives too.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I really liked that, and in fact, my collecting knives is what led us to the design loosely of the Arm and Strom that we released. So,
funny.
Inspiration can come from all sorts of places.
Yeah, that's great. Asher, thanks so much for your time, dude.
This was so much fun. Thank you for letting me talk. That was very kind of you.
No, my pleasure. Always is. I think we should maybe mention the event that we've got coming up, just due to the fact that this will be released hopefully just before the event.
Absolutely. So we're going to be doing together one of several pop-up shops that Collective will be hosting with friends this year. This one will be on February 9th in Hollywood and Los Angeles in the afternoon. More details will come out, including venue, etc. But we would very much love to see you. We, Collective, will have Fears on display, James Lamb on display, and potentially a secret, which will be fun to share.
Right.
And you want to talk a little bit about what you're going to have on site?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I'm treating this pop up as basically the same approach I have at Wind Up, which is everything's going to be there to touch and feel and try on and pick out your sizes. And so come check it out. If you are on the Standard H email list, you are dialed in. You will get more information on that. And if not, then sign up for the email list. And
same if you're on the collective list. We'll be sending out lots of information about this. I'm sure this will not be the only time we'll be together. I anticipate we'll see each other at Wind Up as well. But
for sure,
our hope is to continue not just working with you, but bringing in other folks that we really admire, so that we can all help each other and introduce our brands to folks.
Awesome. Well, like I said, thanks so much, Asher, and looking forward to the event. I will see you very soon.
Looking forward to it, my friend.
Good
Thanks
deal.
for having me.
Yeah. Okay. See ya. This wraps up this episode of the Standard H podcast. If you like what you heard, I'd love it if you'd share it with a friend or two. And if you have a moment, please rate and review the show, as it helps others discover these episodes. It absolutely helps far more than you realize. Shout out to Jensen Reed and Super Beautiful for the theme track, as well as to Clear Audio for the noise canceling headphones. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.